In this video, I'm going to break down the most common taxes that people pay in everyday life in Spain. Let's get right into it. If you're new here, my name is Jonny. I'm originally from the UK, but I've been living and working in Spain for the past 5 years. And on this channel, I talk a lot about finance, investing, saving money, particularly with a focus on Spain. And I also post travel, digital nomad, expat related content as well. So in Spain, you have two types of taxes, basically. You have direct taxes, which are what you pay on like your income, for example, such as income tax, capital gains, and you have indirect taxes as well, which are not necessarily based on how much money you earn or how much gains you made on a particular investment, but they're taxes that may be calculated on the value of certain assets that you hold, on consumption taxes, for example. And so as I was preparing this video, I realized there is quite a long list out there, so I did have to cut this down a little bit. It's not an exhaustive list, because if I were to put every single tax in there, you know, we could enter into debate of what is and what isn't really a tax. I could be covering things that are only applicable to like less than 1% of the population, for example. So I didn't want to go into that, and I wanted to just go into the most common ones. Also, before I get started in this list as well, I'm not a tax professional. Please don't consider this tax advice. If you're looking for tax professionals to help you with the specifics of your situation, then you can check out one of my partners, Pro Spain Consulting, link in the description. With that said, let's get into the list. And so we'll start with an obvious one, personal income tax in Spain, known as IRPF in Spanish, or Impuesto sobre la Renta de Personas Físicas. And so personal income tax in Spain will cover the majority of economic activity that a person does and their investments as well. Every year, Spanish tax residents complete the Declaración de la Renta, which is the tax declaration through the 100 model, where they'll declare all of their income from economic activity, properties, capital gains from investments, dividends, interest received, etc. And so if you're a Spanish tax resident, then it's very likely you'll have to complete this tax declaration. Now, who is considered a Spanish tax resident? There are two main criteria. One being that you spend 183 days or more in Spanish territory over the tax year, which is the same as the natural calendar year, January the 1st to December the 31st. And the second criteria is having your center of vital interests in Spain. That can be your primary economic activity. That can be that you have partner, spouse, children living here, your primary residence in Spain. Anybody who meets one or both of these criteria is normally considered tax resident in Spain. So Spanish tax residents' income from around the world will be taxable in Spain on the Spanish income tax bracket scales. Of course, keeping in mind any double taxation treaties where income has already been taxed with a country that has a double taxation treaty with Spain. And so the progressive scales for Spanish tax residents typically range from 19% at the lower end up to 45-50%, depending on which autonomous community you're in. If you're interested in learning more about how exactly the income tax system works and how taxation works by autonomous community, then you can check out my video up here where I explain it. And you can also check out my income tax calculator as well, which will help you understand your tax liabilities in Spain. Now, there's also the possibility that you're a Spanish non-tax resident, but perhaps you have Spanish sourced income and you need to complete a declaration for that as well. This is known as Impuesto sobre la Renta de No Residentes in Spanish, with the initials IRNR in Spanish or IRNR. Let's say, for example, we have a person who lives in the UK. That's where they're considered an ordinary tax resident, and they don't meet the criteria to be a Spanish tax resident that we mentioned in the previous part of the video. But maybe they have a property in Spain, they rent it out, and they're making some income from that. That would subject their property to taxation as its Spanish sourced income. And so they would have to make a non-resident tax declaration in Spain via the 210 form or Modelo 210. And now, unlike with tax residents in Spain, where the autonomous community scales apply, depending on which part of Spain you're living in, there's kind of a standardized scale for non-residents, ranging from 19% up to 47% through the brackets, depending on what your income level is as a non-resident. And whilst this is something that may not necessarily come to mind, it is important that you fill it out, because if you have Spanish sourced income, then it does create a tax obligation in Spain. But also you may need to use that completed form to ask for tax relief in your home country, if your home country has a double taxation treaty with Spain that provides relief on that income that's already been taxed. Equally, if that income is taxed at the source and it's not a payment that you make automatically, it might be the case that, for example, too much tax is withheld, and by filling out that form, you may be able to ask for a tax refund in Spain. So, important to complete this if you have Spanish sourced income and are not considered tax residents. The next one we have is an indirect tax that applies to individuals, and it's the wealth tax. Now, this wealth tax is actually a funny one, because there's autonomous communities like Catalonia where the wealth tax does exist. And then there's others like Madrid where the wealth tax technically exists, but essentially the autonomous community will give you 100% deduction, so people typically wouldn't pay it. Andalusia also introduced like 100% deduction as well, essentially eliminating it, and then other autonomous communities have their own like deductions and percentages that they've reduced the wealth tax down as well. And typically there's like a universal exemption on your primary residence up to 300,000 euros, and in the case of non-residents, an exemption up to 700,000 euros minimum as well. Putting aside those exemptions, I'll put a table on the screen that shows the percentages that the wealth tax applies on based on the different scales, but it starts down at around 0.2%, with the maximum percentage applicable being 3.5%, and that's only really above 10 million euros of assets. Important to note, however, is that the central government in 2022 introduced what is known in Spanish as like Impuesto Solidario sobre las Grandes Fortunas. Something like that, which is like a supposed to be temporary tax, which essentially is like a solidarity tax on people who have a lot of assets. And whilst it was supposed to be a temporary tax, it's been extended and is still applicable today, and it has been extended once more for 2025 as well. And this essentially overrules like the 100% deductions that I mentioned that exist in Andalusia and Madrid. Just to say that as long as this temporary measure is in place, there is essentially an effective wealth tax across Spain. All right, those are taxes on like a personal level. Now let's talk a little bit about business taxes. So we'll start with like corporate tax rates in Spain. So the standard corporate tax rate in Spain is 25%. That said, it is possible for certain companies to pay a 15% corporate tax rate, specifically in its first year of trading and the first year that it makes a profit. And so this corporate income tax is applicable on Spanish companies or foreign entities that are operating with an effective permanent establishment in Spain. The other main business tax that is applicable in Spain is called the Impuesto sobre Actividades Económicas, or the IAE. This is essentially applicable for Spanish companies, or again entities operating with a permanent establishment in Spain, that have a turnover of greater than 1 million euros in the tax year. And it's not really a straightforward one-size-fits-all calculation. The main two factors are basically how many inhabitants live in the municipality where the business is headquartered, and how big is the operating premises of the business, if I understood it correctly. And so based on the number of inhabitants and the type of activity that's happening, there'll be like a base tax, and then depending on the size of like the business's premises, it will determine like a coefficient to multiply that base tax by, and then that will determine essentially what the tax on economic activity is. All right, now let's move on to consumption taxes, with the most common one here being something that you'll see literally in everyday life. When you go to the supermarket, when you go to the shops, when you pay for a service or buy some goods, is VAT, or IVA as it's known in Spanish. Now there's essentially like three types of VAT in Spain. You've got the standard rate, which is like 21%, and that's applicable on the majority of goods and services in Spain. However, there's a reduced rate of 10%, which is applicable on the purchase of, for example, new homes, on utilities like electricity and gas, on things like hotels, restaurants, when you dine out, and transportation as well. These are probably the most common ones where you see the reduced rate. And then there's a super reduced rate of 4%, which is typically applicable on like medication, and if you are purchasing a vivienda de protección oficial, which is like a protected property, then the 4% rate is applicable on that. And so you, the consumer, essentially pay that VAT whenever there's a transaction for a good or service. And then the business, or the autónomo, if it's a self-employed person, is essentially a collection agent of that VAT, and they then deposit it into the accounts of the tax authorities. Remember as well, if you're visiting Spain as a tourist and you're not an EU resident, then you can reclaim VAT that you've paid on transactions. The key criteria being that you're not a resident in Spain, the EU, or the Canary Islands, that you have an invoice for the goods or services that you purchased, that they're not for commercial use, and in the case of purchasing goods, that they leave the country within 3 months of being purchased. So if you go shopping, buy some clothes, or you buy a new phone, for example, in Spain, then make sure you keep the receipt, the invoice, so that when you go to the airport, you can ask for a VAT refund. The next consumption tax on the list I've talked a lot about in the property videos that I've made, as a lot of properties that people purchase in Spain are second-hand properties, and that's the ITP, Impuesto sobre Transmisiones Patrimoniales. It's like a transfer tax, essentially. Basically, if you purchase second-hand goods, like is the case with a property or a house that someone has lived in before, but it can also be, for example, if you're buying a second-hand car, and you essentially have to pay this transfer tax on the second-hand goods when you purchase them. Like with a personal income tax, the percentage you'll pay varies depending on what autonomous community you live in. It can be down at the 4 to 6% range in some of the lowest cases, up to 10-11% in some of the more expensive autonomous communities. And once you've made the purchase, you typically have 30 days to declare and pay the ITP to the corresponding regional administration. So be sure to do this step on time if you're buying like a second-hand car or you're buying a property in cash. Although if you're buying a second-hand property and there's a bank involved, like they're giving you a mortgage, they may in fact make the ITP payment for you and have the declaration done on your behalf. Another tax that often comes in when it's related to documentation, and specifically when you're buying a new property, like when you're paying VAT, is actos jurídicos documentados. And so this is basically a tax on administrative, business, and notarial documents that have been legalized or done in front of a notary. And the percentage is typically around 0.3%, but can go as high as 1.5%. All right, next category we're going to look at is property taxes. Now keep in mind the ITP and VAT that we just talked about can be applicable for property as well. So what I'm going to focus on in this section is more like taxes that are related to ownership. The main one in Spain being property owner's tax, which is known as IBI. So this is paid once a year to the town hall, the ayuntamiento, although it can often be broken down and paid in installments if you like to. And so the value of property tax that you owe on an annual basis will basically be looking at the cadastral value of the property, which is the figure that is in the property register in Spain, multiplied by the applicable coefficient based on the type of property and where you live, which typically ranges between 0.4 and 1.1%. To give you a general idea, like your annual property tax should typically be like a few €100 a year based on that calculation. But of course, this is a generalization that I'm making here, and it's important to understand what the property tax would be for your property. As a property owner as well, you'll also be liable to pay the tasa de basura, which is basically the rubbish or garbage collection tax. And so again, this very much depends on where you live in the country as well. I'll put a little graph on the screen which shows the 2021 rates, but typically it falls around the €100 range. At the low end, you've got like €40, and at the very top end, €200. But it should end up somewhere in the middle of that range. And then one other property tax to keep in mind, which is applicable when you sell a property, is known as the plusvalía municipal, which is essentially the capital gains that you make on selling that property. And so the plusvalía municipal, unlike other capital gains taxes like dividends or selling shares, is kind of, again, under the remit of the ayuntamiento, the town hall. A couple of years ago, they essentially did a bit of a reform around the law of the plusvalía municipal as to how it can be calculated, giving property owners the possibility to choose between one of two calculation methods based on what works out more advantageous for them. So the first calculation would essentially look at the difference between what the house was purchased for and what it's being sold for now. However, the taxable base in this first calculation would essentially be the land value divided by the cadastral value. So you typically wouldn't pay tax on the full amount of those capital gains. Once the taxable base is determined, it would then be a case of multiplying the taxable base by the effective percentage in the municipality. The second calculation method, instead of looking at the difference between the purchase and the selling price, would look at the cadastral value of the land, and depending on how long you've lived at the property, essentially the time difference between you purchasing it and selling it, would then be multiplied by a coefficient determined by the town hall in order to work out what the percentage tax would be on the gains. So again, speak to a tax professional about this if you're not sure, so that you can understand which is the more advantageous calculation for you. And finally, we're going to finish on some other taxes which don't really fall into any of the prior categories, but are still somewhat common and may be applicable to people who are resident or non-resident in Spain. So the first we're going to start with is gift and inheritance tax. This also falls under the remit of the autonomous communities, and the rates will again depend on what the autonomous communities have set. So in Catalonia, for example, it can be somewhere between 20 and 30% on donations and inheritance, even more I think in some cases. Where in Madrid, if there's inheritance or donations made between family members of different degrees, then often there are significant deductions up to 99% I think in some cases as well. You'll essentially pay very little tax on donation and inheritance in Madrid as a result. But before you accept or receive an inheritance, if you're living in Spain, or if someone from abroad wants to send you money or something, like consult with a tax professional. Can't stress this enough. It's not as simple as just sending the money and then deal with it later. You know, there are tax obligations that this can create in Spain, and not fulfilling them can have consequences for you, so that you can deal with them properly. Road tax is the next one that I'm going to talk about. So this is an annual tax that you'll pay also to the town hall where you live, who determines essentially based on the emission sticker, the type of engine that the car has, what tax it will need to pay to be on the road essentially. I did a video, by the way, where I talked more about the specifics of driving in Spain, so you can check that out here as well if you're interested interested in learning more. And the last one I'm going to talk about is taxes on gambling winnings and winning the lottery. So in the case of winnings from gambling, these need to be declared as with any other personal income, as I mentioned at the start, through the personal income tax declaration. However, in the case of certain lotteries in Spain, specifically like from Loterías y Apuestas del Estado, like the Christmas lotteries from La Once, then you have an exemption on winnings of up to 40,000 euros. So up to 40,000 euros in winnings, you won't pay any tax on. And then above that, you'll pay 20% on any winnings above that. And just to clarify, from like a gambling lottery perspective, this is not something I do, nor would I encourage anyone to do this personally, but perhaps there is somebody watching who this information is useful for. So there you go. Alright guys, there you have it. I hope you found this information interesting and useful. Leave a comment and let me know what you found the most interesting about the taxes that I talked about in this list. If you want to see more content about life in Spain, then be sure to check out these two videos which go into more specifics of other aspects of life in Spain. Till next time, I'll see you in the next one, and let's get this money.